Hello and welcome everyone to our today's event titled Kashmir in the Time of COVID. The event is organized by Brown Kashmir Solidarity Movement, a students group here at Brown University, which aims to highlight the ongoing occupation of and human rights violations in Jammu and Kashmir. The event has been supported by the Center for Contemporary South Asia at the Watson Institute of International and Public Affairs. My name is Suad Yassin, and I'm a PhD candidate here at Brown University in the Department of History. I'll be moderating our today's discussion. Before I introduce the speakers, let me briefly lay out the format of today's event. We have about an hour and 15 minutes in total. We'll have two sessions. In the first session, which will go on for about 45 minutes, we'll ask both our speakers a set of questions. I'll begin with the first set of questions, and then I'll pass on the mic to some of our members of KSM who are here with us. They have their own questions to ask. And once we are done with that, we'll open the discussion for the general Q&A. If you want to ask a question for the second half of the session, please type your questions in the chat box and send them to me. Again, my name is Suad Yassin. You can find me in the chat box. And if you mention your name, what do you do, and your location if you prefer, and I'll read out your questions for the speakers. With that, let me introduce our speakers for today's talk. Our first speaker, Mohamad Junaid, is an assistant professor of anthropology at Massachusetts College of Liberal Arts. He's interested in the production of knowledge about South Asia, the centering of India in that knowledge, and the consequences for those who live in its political, social, and geographical margins. Informed in important ways by his lived experiences in the US, India, and Kashmir, he engages questions about colonial continuities in post-colonial state formation, aporias of democracy and self-determination, history and memory, space and place, and visual logics of geopolitics. Our second speaker is Dr. Samreen Mushtaq, who recently received her PhD in political science from Jamia Millia Islamia University in New Delhi, India. She is currently a research fellow at the Center for Studies in Gender and Sexuality at Ashoka University. Prior to joining the center, she has also worked at the Hindu Center for Politics and Public Policy. Her research and writing focuses on gender and armed conflict and sexual violence as a weapon of war, especially in the case of Kashmir. She has published widely in Economic and Political Weekly, Journal for Contemporary South Asia, The Caravan, Jacobin, Al Jazeera, and Open Democracy. Welcome, Junaid, and welcome, Samreen. And to get going, Junaid, let me ask you the first question, which is more like if you could begin by providing us an overview of what has been called the lockdown before the lockdown in Kashmir, the event since August 2019, especially when the semi-autonomous status of the state was unilaterally revoked by the Indian government. So if you could just contextualize for us what was happening and talk about that, Junaid.
Excuse me. Thank you, Sued. Just want to start by thanking all the people who have made this possible, especially the Kashmir Solidarity Movement at Brown. It's amazing to have students, faculty gather together on these critical issues because they're not happening somewhere else in the world. They just all interconnected and affect us here as well. Not just as Kashmiris, but people who are deeply engaged and concerned about the future of South Asia. So for those members of the audience who do not perhaps have had a chance to deeply engage with Kashmir, the story of Kashmir goes back to 1947, the current annexation of Kashmir, which New Delhi formalized last year on August 5th, 2019. In 47, India invaded and occupied Kashmir, and it went through a series of phases where Kashmiris chose multiple forms of resistance, both electoral and non-electoral. But in 1990, when there was this mass upsurge for freedom in Kashmir, liberation from this colonial control, India brought in hundreds of thousands of soldiers and kind of created an architecture of military occupation. So if you were to ask me about the lockdown before the lockdown, that is the first kind of ring of lockdown. It's sometimes good to imagine Kashmir as a sort of a Russian doll. Some people I was talking to in Kashmir, when they said that, oh, now we have been shut down because of COVID, and they would like saying that, well, yeah, it's just like we are. There was already a shutdown going on, a curfew going on, and that curfew was happening within the overall context of a military siege, which itself happens within the overall context of this occupation. So there are these layers of control, layers of shutdown, layers of restrictions on mobility, restrictions on dissent that have gone on in Kashmir. So this 1990 was followed by, as you know, from 2016, when this new state of kind of siege was imposed all across Kashmir. There were a series of protests that were happening because a popular Kashmiri rebel leader had been killed, Burhan Wani, and people came out mourning for him. And this did not go well with the Indian government, which was already led by right-wing regime of Narendra Modi. And so then in 2019, 2016 started this renewed process of kind of uh, military control, especially in the countryside in South Kashmir, where I grew up. In 2019, then, just before Amit Shah basically passed this new law, who was the home minister at that time and continues to be so, called the Jammu and Kashmir Reorganization Act, which basically split the state of Jammu and Kashmir, the historic state of Jammu and Kashmir, into two union territories, denuded the entire region of any shred of democracy. It had been already preceded by arrest of hundreds of thousands of activists, both from traditionally the incarcerable Kashmiris who are seeking freedom from the Indian control, but also from those pro-India leaders who had historically sided with the Indian regime. So even they were put under bars. So in August 2015, we had this 180,000 additional soldiers that were brought in, which joined. They were already around 750,000 Union soldiers there. So, they had fanned out everywhere. They were like in schools, hospitals, public spaces. And Kashmir was put under communication blockade. The internet was completely taken away. There was no way to, for people to communicate with each other. People didn't even know what the Indian government had done in its parliament, because the news was totally blocked. The Kashmiri newspapers were put under tremendous pressure from reporting on Kashmir-related events. Any political thing that appeared in the Kashmiri media or newspapers was tamped down. Kashmiri journalists were facing a big assault from the state. Some were arrested, others were questioned. They were put in this pigeonhole called the media center, where they had access to, very slow internet, 2G speed. And so this was already going on in Kashmir before this current COVID lockdown that India imposed in March. So in a way, Kashmiris had already kind of become accustomed to 7 months of lockdown before this new lockdown unfolded.
Yeah, thank you, Junaid. That was helpful. And Samreen, if I can bring you in here and following from this, maybe, could you give us a sense of how the lockdown started in Kashmir? Where were you at that time? How was it like?
Hello.
Hi.
So Junaid has already given a fair idea of what it was like when this lockdown started. So I traveled to Kashmir from India 5 or 6 days before the lockdown was announced. And at that point, nothing was really clear in terms of the COVID situation. Uh, so I think it was, for me, it was largely that uncertainty that made me decide that I wanted to be home in Kashmir during this time. Uh, August last year was a terrible experience for us who were away from home. Uh, of course, not even comparing it with what it was like in Kashmir at that time. Uh, And also, this was not the first time that Kashmir was cut off from the world, but it was also something that happened for a much longer period this time. Uh, so that was one reason that I decided to come home. Also, India has not really been a comfortable space for Kashmiris. The kind of harassment and beatings that have happened, add to it this anti-Muslim violence in Delhi that happened this year. So in that context, uh, those multiple vulnerabilities, plus this fact that uh, this fear and anxiety that Kashmir could be cut off at any moment, uh, is what really made a lot of us decide that we wanted to be in Kashmir during this time. Uh, so over the weeks following the COVID lockdown, what we saw was that on the ground nothing really changed in terms of the military occupation. In fact, COVID became this opportunity to intensify violent control. So this was quite visible, in the sense that the Indian state was responding to the COVID pandemic in Kashmir. It totally followed this counter-insurgency pattern, where you saw the methods that were employed. For example, people who would go out on the streets would be beaten, even if it was a case of emergency. Uh, you saw more concertina wires coming up everywhere. Barricades were erected in the name of containing the spread of the infection, although with the kind of logic that was used to do so. You clearly saw this as a way of segregation. Uh, Now, in terms of the quarantine centers, in a case that I personally know of, a friend traveled from Delhi to Kashmir, and he was shifted to a quarantine center. He complained of the facilities, put up some pictures on his social media account, and the post really attracted some attention, and soon enough he was beaten. He was threatened that a case would be filed against him. Um, he was accused of having beaten a policeman in the quarantine facility. Um, and the complaint also said that he had been uncooperative. um, his stay in the center was in fact extended for more period than he was supposed to be there, uh, simply because this was a way of targeting him for having dared complain against the government. Uh, in general, overall, it was really horrifying for people, especially women who would be taken to quarantine centers in armored military vehicles. And you need to see this in the context of the gender based violence that has been intrinsic to India's control of Kashmir. So, largely to the Kashmiri psyche, quarantine then sounded like a form of imprisonment, seeing how it was managed by the Indian state. Therefore, no surprises really when a lot of people actually hid their travel histories uh, of having come from foreign countries when they arrived in Srinagar. Uh, Even the language that was used in official directives during this time um, echoes this counterinsurgency manual. So, you threaten dire action, you speak of contact tracing like a form of retributive warfare. Uh, you speak of um, how surveillance teams are really brilliant in tracing out suspects. You speak of hunting down people, intercepting suspects, and uh, also asking people for anonymous inputs in case someone they know or someone in their neighborhood is trying to hide their travel history, uh, so that the evaders could be tracked down. So in terms of both the language and the methods employed, you could see a continuation of counterinsurgency methods in a way. And then there was also this all pervasive surveillance with a hyper visible bureaucratic structure that you saw, um, that took it upon itself to even hold medical bulletins. So the bureaucrats very proudly spoke of how they used how they tracked phones, how they used heat maps, how they looked at ATM histories in order to trace COVID suspects. And with this surveillance infrastructure that you obviously realize did not come up overnight. But what the pandemic response does is that it sets an easy precedence where such surveillance infrastructure would only be broadened in the future. So overall, the lockdown that was actually supposed to control the infection was used to control people, which is a way of the Indian state of its military occupation in Kashmir over the decades, really.
Thank you for summarizing that situation as it unfolded in Kashmir so well for us. Here, let me bring in Kanha. Kana is a member of KSM here at Brown, and he has a question, I believe, for Junaid. Kana, can you go on?
So, Professor Junaid, this question is for you. Um,
Sorry, maybe also speak a few words about yourself, what you do, and
okay, sure. I'm an undergrad rising senior. So, Professor Junaid, I wanted to ask you that one of the new experiences for many of us in the time of COVID, of quarantine or lockdown. So we weren't allowed to leave our homes for extended periods of time. You already mentioned how Kashmiris have been well versed in dealing with curfews for about 30 or so years, in which the Indian government basically controls their movement by forcing them to wait in their homes for periods that can range from a few days to several months. So I wanted to ask you, and I think Dr. Samreen already started to elaborate on this, is if there's something new about the experience of lockdown, in the sense of, is the Indian state trying to impose any new forms of control, which we haven't seen in curfews, for example?
Yeah, thank you, Kana. Well, so the occupation in Kashmir is really the occupation of both space and time. It's this arbitrary control that the Indian state imposes on the Kashmiri everyday life in Kashmir. Samreen already mentioned that this was not a new experience. When we were growing up in Kashmir in early 90s, I remember the first curfew, this major curfew was launched in January 1990 and lasted for several months at that time. And then we had, like, during the 90s, several periods when people would basically be forced to sit down, wait endlessly in their homes, never knowing when the curfew would be lifted. And the Indian government would almost play with the Kashmiri everyday life, sometimes giving what they call deal. Which would be like, we'd be then go out like probably after 6 p.m. occasionally. On other days, regular days, we were told that we can't go out after 6 p.m. because it was like the military patrols could just like go and pick us up and torture us. I mean, so many Kashmiris disappeared over the years because the Indian government's occupation is also a structure of incentives that they have put in place for the military. Because if you kill so many militants, or if you catch or recover arms and whatnot, you get, your company or your unit gets citations, awards, and rewards, and which kind of basically incentivized overall military criminality in Kashmir. They've just randomly picked people away. So what I'm trying to say is that on one level, there was this temporal control that the Indian occupation used in Kashmir. At another level, and much more disastrously, it was the control over space. And this space is right now, I mean, I think we're at the heart of it, because the Indian military, first of all, controls thousands of hectares of land in Kashmir, and they have occupied this land since 1947. But over the years, the military camps have become bigger, their cantonments have become larger, but they also like spread out in civilian spaces, the public spaces where ordinary people would be able to walk or stuff, or reach essential services like hospitals. All those spaces came under control of the military. which it's like this intensification. That's why I called it at the beginning the architecture of occupation, because it is a hardened structure. I mean, the Indian government's control primarily is basically allowing very little space and time for people to act and do any kind of public form of protest. I mean, of course, right now every protest has been banned, but any kind of politics, there are very small avenues that it has left. Basically, taking away all form of agency and mobility from Kashmiris.
Thank you, Junaid. Let me ask Anchita. She has a question for Samreen. Anchita, can you hear us?
Yeah, I can.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Anchita. I'm a rising senior as well. I'm from Kolkata and I study history and Middle East studies. And I'm very glad that we are able to have you speak with us today. It's been very informative. Samreen, I wanted to ask you. You went to Kashmir from Delhi right before the lockdown for COVID started, if I'm correct. And I wanted to ask you what your sense of how it unfolded was in both places, and the situation that the migrant workers found themselves in, especially in Delhi and in North India. Like how did that situation compare with Kashmiris who had been facing lockdown at that point for almost over 9 months, I think. So how did the similarities, and what were the similarities and dissimilarities that you found between those situations?
I think something that the pandemic really did was to acutely visualize the class differences. Uh, so heartbreaking pictures emerged from India of the migrant crisis, uh, without a source of income, with a looming sense of hunger, with buses and trains suspended. Uh, the only option left for hundreds and thousands of migrants was to take these long walks home, which meant like hundreds of kilometers without food. So, on the one end, you saw the state facilitating travel for its people who were stuck in foreign countries. Um, and on the other end, you saw these migrants who were left on their own with absolute apathy from the Indian state. Uh, in the Indian parliament, the government went on to say that it had no data on the number of migrant workers who had died in the lockdown. And it also sort of evaded responsibility as it blamed fake news for triggering this panic that resulted in the migrant crisis. But independent reports do suggest that over 200 migrant workers died, some after having walked long distances and from hunger, and some of them in road accidents. This pandemic in the Indian context was also used to uh, curb the protests that had been happening for some months in India against the Citizenship Amendment Act and arrest of political activists. Then there was also Islamophobia that accompanied the state response in India. So you had these wild debates on Indian media where uh, this was, spoken of as this great Muslim uh, a congregation of Muslims in Delhi was especially targeted. They were called as super spreaders. And in fact, in the daily bulletins regarding the number of infections that the Indian government gave, uh, these people were listed separately. And also, in many cases, you read reports where hospitals had turned away Muslim patients, even if they were there for non COVID treatment. It was only last week, actually, that a court acquitted 20 foreigners who had attended this congregation in Delhi after finding no evidence against them. So, in that state in Kashmir, in the sense that is narrative, some.
So, Samreen, your voice is breaking.
So in the case of Kashmir, how it unfolded was I Okay.
Yeah, it's okay now. If you can repeat.
Audible now?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I'm on an unstable internet connection here. Yeah, so in the case of Kashmir, the way it unfolds, regulations, uh, am I audible?
Yeah, go ahead. It's slow, but it's okay.
Uh, Hello?
Go ahead, speak.
Yeah. So in the case of Kashmir, is that okay?
Yeah.
Uh, so how you saw it, a lot of rumors and speculations. Uh, so it was spoken of as this great Indian conspiracy. Probably because this was following from previous experiences that Kashmiris have of the Indian state, of its lies and deceit over the years. Uh, so Kashmiris are absolutely wary of anything that the Indian state says or does, and they would rather believe the opposite. Uh, so also the way the Indian state dealt with it in Kashmir, as I said earlier, only went on to strengthen this perception that COVID was being used as an excuse to strengthen the military occupation. For example, a single case meant that an entire area was cut off, permanent iron barricades were used uh, in a way that it defied logic. So people wondered what they were supposed to do in case there was a fire or a medical emergency. Uh, so it was like the pandemic was used to set in this defamiliarization of home through these sophisticated blockades, mazes of concertina, etc. So on a larger level, yes, one might think of the commonalities that exist in these contexts in terms of how states generally are known to, oppress the most marginalized, the othering of particular communities, or the way certain lives are dispensable for these states. But what is additional, uh, and in fact central in the case of Kashmir, is the political context. India is a military occupation in Kashmir, and Kashmiris do see the way India has treated its own people, and they do not have any hopes from this structure that only wants to use any means to suppress the demand for right to self-determination by Kashmiris. So you do not really frame it as a case of grievances. Yeah, so
Thank you,
you do
Sunil.
not really.
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead, finish the sentence, finish your thought. Sorry.
Yeah, you cannot really frame this as a case of citizens' grievances against the state, which is why we also talk of Kashmiris being on their own in the fight against this pandemic, just as they are fighting a military occupation. So this is another battle happening alongside.
Thank you. Uh, I just wanted to mention for the general audience, um, if you have questions to ask, please type them out in the chat box. Send them to me. You can find me under the host if you look at the list of people attending the program, and we'll collect your questions and I'll convey them to the speakers in the second session. And right now, let me bring in Sunil. Sunil, can you hear us?
Thank you.
Yeah, Sunil has a question for Junaid. Yeah, go ahead, Sunil.
Yeah, so my name is Sunil. I'm a senior as well, studying public health and English. Thank you to both the professors for your time today. We really appreciate hearing from you. So yeah, my question is for Professor Junaid. So thinking about the protests in Shaheen Bagh and the anti-Muslim rioting that followed, and then the response of the police, we're seeing more and more in the past year, this comparison being made that India is turning into Kashmir. So would you be able to give us a more historical sense of that saying that, India is turning into Kashmir?
Yeah, thank you, Sunil. See, the way I think about this question is that, of course, Samreen has brilliantly laid out like all these different tactics of counterinsurgency that the Indian state employs in Kashmir. But for all of us, we have to understand that there's a longer history, broader history of what I call the exchange of oppressive techniques that happen across the world. I mean, when I look at, for instance, I'm based here in Massachusetts. Some of you are close to Massachusetts. And I look at the techniques that the settlers employed against the Native Americans, from green berets, and the kind of laws that were used um, to dispossess the natives, the kind of rhetoric that accompanied settler colonialism. I can't but wonder, like, how much are Indian policymakers learning from them, because these techniques travel from one place to another. They are like traveling theories from the colonization of Americas to the French colonization of the North Africa, especially Algeria, and then to India itself. When we were growing up in Kashmir in the 90s, in our neighborhood, there used to be a military camp where I would find these Naga soldiers. Um, and I would often like wonder, what are they doing in Kashmir? Where are they from? They didn't at that time, we didn't know much about India except through what we were learning from the India's Doordarshan, their national television and its movies. And I would ask them where they were from, and then they would talk about that they were from Nagaland. And in their own private conversations, sometimes they would be like, we don't know what we're doing here. Our own people have been bombed, harassed. Our nation has been oppressed. Nagaland was the first place where India extensively used fighter bombers, and artillery to destroy people. Outside the context of Kashmir, where India had participated along with the Maharajas, the last Kashmiri Hindu ruler. They participated in a genocide in the southern province of Jammu of close to 250,000 Muslims. But then you go to Punjab, the same techniques were used in Punjab which were honed later on in Kashmir. In Chhattisgarh, for instance, or Jharkhand, against the indigenous communities, the Adivasis, the Indian government employed very similar tactics of counterinsurgency. So when people say that India is becoming like Kashmir, there is a grain of truth to it. When you have an entire officialdom, a bureaucratic military structure that kind of like gets its training from the scorched earths of Kashmir, where you like are oppressive towards the people. Of course, you carry some of those techniques back into the mainland, but I kind of am wary of this comparison, because India is not becoming like Kashmir. India is India. India has always been oppressive towards its marginalized populations, towards those people who it does not consider either full citizens or people, in itself, who it culturally otherizes. Some of the liberal commentators in Delhi do like to make that comparison for sensationalist purposes. But from my understanding, India has been an empire. It inherited an empire from the British in 1947. And ever since then, it has been continuously engaged without a stop. Just like America, without a stop, it has been engaged in war against the marginalized populations along its borders.
Yeah, thank you, Junaid. We have Samira here with us. Samira, she has a question for Samreen. Samira, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Samira, undergraduate sophomore studying math and theater, and also a member of KSM. So my question for you, Samreen, is, since you have been in Kashmir for like this whole time, what modes of political activity did you see or hear about? So like I'm thinking, for example, of the recent decision by the Indian government to not return the bodies of rebels and victims of fake encounters by citing COVID protocol. So what are some of the ways that India has used the health situation to make the occupation more intense?
The COVID lockdown in Kashmir was an extension of the August 2019 siege in a lot of ways, that Junaid has also pointed out, and only a strengthening of varied practices of settler colonialism. Uh, as you pointed out, one of the ways in which this control was further strengthened uh, was by denying funerals, not returning the bodies of rebels and civilians who were killed by the Indian forces. In May this year, a 14-year-old boy was killed in what the police termed as the case of crossfire. Um, when his family demanded the body, it was not returned, and the authorities cited the COVID protocol in place, meant to stop huge gatherings, so they did not want the funeral to take place. Uh, in another case that happened in September, a youth was killed in custody, and the body was not returned to the family. It was buried over 100 kilometers away, and only a few family members were allowed to be in attendance. Um, in some cases, the identities of those killed were not even revealed. In one case that I want to mention here, that took place in Shupian, south of Srinagar, uh, 3 men were killed, labeled as militants, and buried by the authorities. Um, it was only later, when pictures emerged and the families reported them missing, that this was found to be a case of a fake encounter. Uh, so of course, you see, when you deny funerals, you do not allow burials, you do not reveal identities, this does have a greater chance of fake encounters happening, uh, because of the incentives that are given in these cases, as Junaid already spoke about. In some cases, the grieving families were actually bounced from one office to another, for getting a DNA test done only so that they could visit the graves of their loved ones. Um, so COVID protocol was largely only a cover for these practices, and something that was used to mask also the anxieties of the Indian state itself, which have over the years been multiplied by these funerals of the rebels, where you see thousands of people in attendance, uh, shouting pro-freedom slogans. These funerals have been a referendum of sorts in their own way, sites of collective grieving and resistance for the Kashmiri people, and in fact people's rejection of the Indian state in the loudest terms. Uh, so it was quite obvious that even as COVID protocol was cited, the reason was really different. Uh, Also, cordon and search operations, where Indian soldiers, dozens of Indian soldiers, enter homes on the pretext of searching them. They have continued unabated during this time. Homes have been razed to the ground, which has been in continuation with a practice that has happened for decades now in Kashmir, meant to break the will of the Kashmiri people. Uh, so there is a very selective way the COVID protocol has come to work in Kashmir. Also, while we look at this recent practice of denying burials, one must think of it in continuation with mass and unmarked graves that dot Kashmir's landscape and that have been unearthed by civil society groups in the last decades. Another aspect that I'd like to talk about here, something that's largely uh, been invisibilized, but Junaid did mention it earlier, is the detention of the entire pro-freedom leadership and hundreds of Kashmiri men and women. Uh, the Indian state hyped the hotel and home detentions of pro-India client politicians so much, m- and its media clung to the same narrative, uh, that what was sought to be invisibilized was also these detentions of the pro-freedom leadership and freedom-seeking Kashmiri population. Um, Speaking about this is not for the reason that there are expectations from the Indian state, but only to challenge these multiple erasures that the state seeks to set in. So everything that the Indian state has been doing during this time has been basically an extension of its settler colonial project, and you see these events happening with more urgency post August 2019.
Thank you. Kana, if you could ask, Kana has a question for you both. So Kana, go ahead.
Yeah, so this is a question to both of you. So either or both of you, please feel free to answer this. So how have doctors and health workers more generally in Kashmir been affected by the simultaneous nature of the occupation and the pandemic?
Junaid, you want to go first?
Maybe Samreen, because you are located there. I mean, I have only heard secondhand narratives, so probably Samreen would be a better person to answer this question.
I think the major issue really was that the healthcare system had to work within the limits set by a military occupation, uh, even in the context of such a pandemic. Uh, a major issue has been how decisions that had to come from medical experts really have been coming from the bureaucratic structure. Uh, so in the initial phase, even asymptomatic patients were being quarantined at hospitals. Uh, and you have to remember this was happening in a context where you have a total of 97 ventilators for a population of 7 million, but also a context where you have one Indian soldier for every 10 Kashmiris. Uh, so the hospital infrastructure was overwhelmed, and you had doctors asking the administration to please allow asymptomatic patients to be quarantined at their homes because of the pressure on the hospitals. Another thing that has impacted the healthcare system's response to the pandemic is also the ban on high speed internet. Um, so it has made doctors it very difficult for doctors to actually go for have video consultations, and also they have complained of how they are unable to access medical updates on the pandemic and information that could help them in dealing with it. So in the first few months, you saw a lot of healthcare workers, doctors taking to social media or speaking to journalists about this issue and how this was severely impacting their work. And what followed, quite expectedly, really, was that the government threatened doctors with strict action if they were to talk to the media and, complain against the government. In May, also, you had pictures that emerged from Srinagar where police personnel were seen handing over roses to the doctors. This was basically a damage control exercise, because what had happened was that the counterinsurgency response that I spoke of, so doctors used to be beaten every day, even when they would show their cards and, speak of them being frontline workers during this time. Uh, so then in that damage control exercise, you saw police personnel handing over roses to doctors, and it was really an interesting sight, because what you saw was roses in one hand and guns in the other hand, pretty much like the narrative India sells on Kashmir amid continued violence. uh, so also I think something else that was done during this time is when more restrictions were put on people's movement. It was announced that the valley would be open to tourists, so that only meant additional pressure on a healthcare system that was already close to crumbling. So these have been the major issues that the healthcare system has faced during time.
Yeah, and I forgot to mention in my question that similar to the image of the roses, there was also a popular image of a army man pointing his rifle at an ambulance, which was also circulating. So an ambulance had been stopped at the checkpoint, and the army person was pointing his rifle at the ambulance.
Yeah. Samreen, you want to respond to that?
Yes, those pictures have been pretty common, and ambulances have been stopped a lot of times. We've seen that happen in 2016. We see that happening now. So it's basically just an extension of Indian state's occupation and control, extending to the healthcare system in the times of a pandemic as well.
Okay, thank you, Junaid, and thank you, Samreen. So I think this is the time we move on to our second session, and I'll read out the questions from the audience. I have a bunch of them here, and please, both of you, feel free to sort of jump in. Uh, some questions are for both of you, some they haven't written. Anyway, let me just read. Our first question is from Shahana Ghosh. Thank you, Samreen and Junaid, for your remarks. Samreen, many thanks, especially for your insights on the gendered aspects of the COVID chapter of the lockdown. I'm struck by your comments about how hospitalization emerges as a new mode or site of detention, incarceration, uh, and a familiar occupation tactic. I wanted to hear more about how the health medical system is turning into a battleground of control, perhaps in a gendered way. Could you elaborate on this? Are there state-private healthcare differences? Has there been so for a long time? How should we think about this domain, and what is at stake beyond the immediate vital issue of access to emergency needs? Samreen, you want to?
I'm not sure how to answer that because have not really been, close to the healthcare system in that sense. But also, I think even in terms of access to the public space in these times, because the militarization has been intensified so much and the number of checkpoints during COVID lockdown has certainly expanded. Uh, I think it is in these senses that the space is also restricted to women further because of the nature of the militarized structure. And I remember the anxieties of a few families where some women were supposed to have their deliveries around this time, and they did not know how to navigate this terrain where uh, you were at you know where you were supposed to cross these military installations uh, during this emergency. So I think in that sense, women's access to these spaces was restricted even further because of the kinds of gendered violence uh, that is quite central to basically India's control of Kashmir and plays out in everyday life in that sense. Uh, uh, Other than that, I don't really have much of an experience of how it was for example, female healthcare workers, etc., who were again navigating the limits set by a military occupation. So I would not really say much on that.
Junaid, you want to sort of respond to that?
Just a quick, fact about the healthcare situation in Kashmir. There was a recent report that came out in Al Jazeera, which mentioned that in India, the number of doctors per citizenship is quite low, 1 per 2,000 in India. In Kashmir, it's 1 per 3,800. So almost the double. And for those of you who don't know, Kashmir's topography is quite hilly in many places. The infrastructure is already poor. The civilian infrastructure is already poor, and most of the infrastructural developments that take place in Kashmir are oriented towards military and logistical movement, towards in the border areas. So access to hospitals, access to healthcare is already extremely poor in Kashmir. The second thing is that this history of occupation has, of course, destroyed the actual physical infrastructure of healthcare. In the 90s, the military did not, when the Indian military came in their hundreds of thousands, they didn't have anywhere to stay. So they just barged into schools and hospitals. And for years, even patients were frisked before they could enter the hospitals. And you can imagine, women in a place like Kashmir having to go through a place like that, where, already women were facing hurdles accessing healthcare, but having to go through this horrifying experience of Indian soldiers being present even further limited access for them to the to essential care. I mean, but in general, and this is the last thing I probably Kashmir is going through multiple pandemics or epidemics at the same time. There is COVID is one, but there is a mental health crisis that has been going on for the last 30 years. There's just like a huge percentage of, there was a report a few years back by Médecins Sans Frontières, which I think, if I'm remembering correctly, said around 40% of the Kashmiri population has mental health issues. And there is absolutely zero care available for these people. And their trauma is compounded by the presence of Indian military there. But there is also other things like, I mentioned how Indian military controls everyday mobility in Kashmir. When I was there last summer, just before the Indian government's decision to, pass these new laws, a lot of people were telling me that they were these were diabetics, people who have chronic diabetes, and how the lockdowns, how these curfews and sieges limit their ability to not only access proper medicines, but also their ability to walk. It's essential for people like that to be able to walk, to keep their bodies functioning. Kashmir is also a pit of fake medicine. There is no regulation at all in Kashmir. Whatever India, the Indian pharmaceutical companies, they just dump their medicines in Kashmir. And I mean, of course, there's no proper study done. One can only bank on anecdotal evidence. But the common thing that I hear from Kashmiris all the time is that these medicines are fake. They don't work, so it's a really pathetic situation, and very, and it's not like automatic, or it hasn't built up on its own. It's a deliberate strategy to keep Kashmiris sick and in a state of mental illness.
Thank you, Junaid. Let me read out this next question we have from Amit K. Bali. There is no doubt that whatever happened and is happening is undemocratic and not fair, but it would be injustice not to mention here the main reasons for the abrogation of Article 370 and 35A suddenly. Main reasons of abrogation and situation like this suddenly, like challenges of terrorism, regional disparities, POK and in some parts to China by Pakistan, issues of refugees in Jammu and their PRC. So basically, wasn't it justified that Indian government had to abrogate the semi-autonomous status of Jammu and Kashmir because of challenges of quote-unquote terrorism, regional disparities, what's happening in the Pakistan-administered Kashmir and China? Yeah, is that clear?
Well, first of all, historically, the Hindutva regime, be it in the form of BJP's previous avatars, RSS, which is this mothership of all Hindu right organizations in India, they've had this plan to remove 370 from the very beginning. So the so-called terrorism, according to India, began in 1990. And for 30 years, for the previous 40 years as well, the BJP and the RSS were saying the same thing, that we need to remove 370. The second thing, the Indian government talks about economy and development and whatever regional disparity. But, this famous Indian economist, John Dries, French economist who works in India, has written extensively on India's developmental history. He came out and argued that Kashmir's developmental indices were way higher than the developmental indices of many states that were ruled by the BJP. According to the indices of Human Development Index, I mean, there's the reason behind this are the historic land reforms that took place in post 1947, which had nothing to do with India. Actually, in fact, India tried to block it. The right-wing parties in India tried to block it. But there had been this long history of struggle against feudalism, feudal, regime that had been controlling Kashmir. So it created an overall structure of more or less, giving land to the tiller, the peasantry, removing historic debts that had accumulated, and all of that basically kind of created a more egalitarian society. I mean, those things have come under tremendous pressure over the years. And now, yesterday, India basically completely undid this history of progressive land reforms by removing any protection of land in Kashmir. So yeah, this whole developmental argument that India made justifying removal of 370 was complete bogus. The question of refugees, yes, there are refugees, but the refugees are of all different varieties. In 1947, there were close to 500,000 Muslims from Jammu who were evicted and are living in Pakistan or Pakistani-administered Kashmir. From 1947, there have been several wars, and during each war, the Indian military has pushed out Kashmiris, primarily, of course, all of the Muslims, to the other side. Will the Indian government allow them to return? Will they have the right to return to Kashmir? With the CAA, one of the big issues that Kashmiris who were living, who had been living, waiting to return to their homeland, were facing was that India would not allow Muslims, including Muslim Kashmiris, from being able to reclaim their citizenship in Kashmir. So that was bogus as well. I mean, there's the question of India, this right-wing regime made the argument that the 370 was anti-caste or anti-Dalit, which is completely, again, I mean, I'm using bogus a lot, but it was again a bogus argument because the land reforms in 1950s actually helped the Dalit communities in Kashmir, who were similarly dispossessed as Kashmir's Muslim a majority, who had been peasants without rights over their lands. So they had also gotten title over lands that had been occupied by the feudal autocracy. And there was a small segment of, Dalit community that had been brought by an India-friendly regime in Kashmir in 1950s, who could have easily been given citizenship. No Kashmiri ever. In my entire history of scholarship and my personal experience, I've never heard any Kashmiri say that the Dalit community in Jammu who had been asking for permanent residency rights should be denied that right. And no Kashmiri ever made an argument, for instance, that any Kashmiri woman who marries outside should be denied any rights. In fact, in 2004, the High Court of Jammu had already passed defeated this argument of the India-friendly regime in Kashmir that the women should be denied that right. And they had full inheritance rights. So all the arguments that the Indian government made, the BJP government made to remove 370 were false, were not based on historical fact, and were completely made to hoodwink India's own people who cheered 370 as some kind of a progressive legislation, completely ignoring the fact that what this act was a blatant settler colonial imposition on Kashmir. If it was meant to increase democracy in Kashmir, why was the Indian, the Kashmiri even pro-India leadership, PDP and NC, put behind bars? Why was the Legislative Assembly dissolved 18 months previously? How come the Kashmiris had absolutely no say, including the people of Jammu or Ladakh? How come they had no say in deciding about this new law that the Indian government introduced, right?
Samreen, you want to add anything?
Junaid has pretty much covered whatever I would have wanted to say, but I only wanted to speak about the gendered aspect because that was used as one of the, strongest arguments by those who were favoring the reading down of Article 35A. So basically what it is the Indian state trying to use the colonial savior narrative for Kashmiri women, and we see that used a lot. For us Kashmiri women, it's like we're really oppressed by our society, and therefore would require the Indian state to come to our rescue. But I think Kashmiris, through their narratives, through our narratives, have challenged all of these notions over time. And for a state that bases itself on an illegal military occupation, for a state whose existence is so much based on violence in the everyday against Kashmiris, I think these notions of empowerment, these notions of bringing development to Kashmir, Kashmiris do know the truth of it. And as Junaid said, it's all bogus. So that's just it.
All right, let me follow up on this with our next question. This is from Beanish Bashir, who is a mass communication student in Kashmir. The question is specifically for Dr. Samreen, but Junaid, I think also feel free to sort of pitch in later. Amidst lockdown, abrogation of Article 37 and 35A happened, and consequently the new domicile law. Is it worrisome for common people? How should it be seen, keeping in view what happened in Assam, where people were termed refugees in spite of having documents? And should we be expecting something like that happening here in Kashmir? Yeah. Samreen, you want to go first?
I think how I have looked at all of that has been happening since August 2019 is as more of a continuation of what the Indian state started in 1947, starting with the Jammu massacre, where over 200,000 Muslims were killed. So largely, it is that continuation of violence and control, but also how it has happened post August 2019 is with a lot of urgency. So today you had new land laws being notified, where any Indian citizen is allowed to buy land in Kashmir, whether or not they hold the permanent residence or the domicile certificates. Is it worrying? Yes, it is, because now you see this as a strengthening of settler colonialism in a lot of ways. And although at this point it may not look like one where there is an out and out genocide, or one where Kashmiris are suddenly thrown out and settlers are brought in, but it does look like something where erasure and assimilation of Kashmir as this integral part and as this crown of India is taking place. So even if it's not, it may not at this point, it may not look like, displacement of sorts, although with today's land laws, it does look like that is in the offing, but still it is like that distinction of, who Kashmir belongs to, of Kashmiris as distinct from Indians. That is what is sought to be erased through what the Indian state has been doing, especially since August 2019, but also that we need to look at it in continuation of the military occupation since 1947.
Junaid, you want to pitch in? Should we be worried?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. See, when I began by talking about this history of settler colonialism as it has unfolded across the world, it never goes well. It starts with small gestures of savior nationalism, as Samreen pointed out, translates into laws that are discriminatory, that use this rhetoric of integration, use this rhetoric of progressive legislation, and eventually ends up in expulsion, genocide of the native peoples. And that's what has been unfolding since 1947. And now these new laws that Indian government is passing without any consultation with the people of Kashmir since last year is like the culmination of this long process, which will eventually lead to disaster. Look, when I look at Kashmir and I look at the control that India has on Kashmir, first of all, there are these thousands of hectares of land that are already under military control, and they are occupying more and more land. Second, there are a large portion of Kashmir is what is called state property, which is under the stewardship of the state. That land is ecologically fragile. And that land is being given to mining companies from India. Our riverbeds are being kind of basically auctioned out to Indian mining companies. And first of all, we'll have this ravaging of Kashmir's natural landscape. Second, we'll have these military cantonments, military areas turning into settler colonies. And what it leads to eventually is discriminatory laws where you have a group of privileged citizens um, who enjoy rights of full citizenship, and a discriminated majority, as I mean, we know how it started in Palestine, for instance, who will be like, because they will resist these punishments, these punitive laws will be further enhanced against them. And eventually there is already a discourse within the Hindu right wing that Kashmir is the sacred Hindu land, and they see Muslims as a problem. You only have to go to the RSS's website, which clearly says the problem in Kashmir is its oppressive Muslim majority. That's the goal. Like their solution is a demographic solution. However, they achieve it by expulsion, genocide, or by turning the majority into a minority. So yeah, if you ask me whether we should be afraid, very much so. I tell a lot of Kashmiris like perhaps the only way right now to resist is because we don't have any means to resist the Indian state. It's a huge state with enormous power over our lives. But the only way we can do that is by learning from successful indigenous movements who claim their rights over the land, historic rights over the forests, and refuse to sell their land, and refuse into this oppressive integration project.
Thank you, Junaid. Our next question is from Ahmar Alavi from Aligarh, UP. This is for Samreen. Will you please give us insights on the status of medical facilities being rendered to Kashmiri Muslims? Is there any segregation being done on the basis of religion when it comes to testing, ICU facility, etc.? In Gujarat and Uttar Pradesh, Muslims were denied entry into hospitals and medical facilities. Thank you. Samreen?
Sorry, my internet connection is a little unstable because India has restricted internet access in Kashmir. So I am turning off my video for hopefully better audio quality. I did speak earlier of how Muslims were not allowed in certain hospitals in India, but that has not been the case in Kashmir because the healthcare Kashmir is primarily a Muslim majority, and the healthcare workers, people at the forefront of the healthcare system, are largely Muslim. So in that sense, there is, from what I know, there is not that discrimination of people, not being tested. But overall, in the larger way that the state has, uh, facilitated, the state's role in the pandemic has, of course, been to um, intensify militarization rather than prioritize healthcare, uh, which obviously has brought up issues that I spoke of earlier. But in the sense of, say, access to ICUs, etc., the problem has largely been that the healthcare system is not well equipped because it has never been the priority, but not in the sense of Muslims facing a discrimination there.
Thank you, Samreen. Let me read out the next question, which is for both of you, also slightly related. This is from Akib Hassan. Greetings. Please ask our speakers how do you think that COVID is being used by Indian authorities as a tool to change demography? How true are COVID figures being shown or put forward by the authorities? Do you feel the restrictions imposed by authorities are mainly meant to colonize the valley at a larger level? Junaid, you want to go first? COVID as a tool.
Um, well, I think Samreen has kind of answered a lot of questions, kind of that were related to this. I mean, she already argued how it was an extension of this counterinsurgency policy in Kashmir. About the COVID numbers, I don't know. I think that many people here in the U.S. as well who are watching what's happening in India. I mean, India's response to COVID has been disastrous. You know, Modi imposed this disastrous lockdown at the beginning, but then when things got worse, he just like opened up. So in Kashmir too, the numbers have been low. At some point they had grown higher, but then the numbers started mysteriously going low because I think that either there wasn't enough testing done. Second, the people, even if they felt the symptoms, they were afraid of approaching the authorities because these quarantine facilities that had been placed for common people in Kashmir were in a terrible state, and finally, I think that one of the big problem has been that the Indian soldiers in Kashmir and in Ladakh, where there's a major kind of like confrontation brewing up with China, there have been a large number of coronavirus cases that go unreported. I mean, sometimes the news trickles through, but they don't want to talk about it. I think most of these soldiers also come from poorer parts of India or from the underrepresented castes in India. So their lives also do not matter for the upper caste regime that controls India right now.
Samreen, you want to talk about the COVID numbers maybe?
Uh, the way the numbers, we've really seen them. So sometimes, personally, like around, I would see a lot of cases, and in the evening when you saw the number of cases that were reported, and you would be shocked that, if there are this number of cases that I know of, how is it that the overall number is so low? uh, but that's also, it probably could be something to do with the Indian state's policies, because on certain days you had, so I come from Baramulla, which is to the north of Srinagar. So on certain days you had like 5 or 10 cases reported in Baramulla, and then you would have the lockdown extended in Baramulla and not in other areas. So it did not really make sense, which is why people have been seeing everything that the state has done uh, with a lot of skepticism, because obviously there is no trust there. Uh, Also, something that I should add in connection also with the previous question about Muslims is that in recent times, especially, there have been a lot of news reports that say uh, the bureaucracy is largely, it is being ensured that there are no Muslims left in the bureaucracy in Kashmir. So that's being done quite a lot, obviously, to have a more stronger, more state centric, a more pro state bureaucratic structure where you do not have this question of Muslim solidarity really coming in. Uh, so largely also to the Kashmiri mind, the way the Indian state has gone about in responding to the pandemic has been one where it's not really different from imprisonment in the way the state has done it. So one would think a lot of times before approaching healthcare facilities for this reason, uh, which could be another reason for maybe lower numbers. But yes, testing in the initial days was really restricted. So in the initial days, in a case in the family, my 6-month-old niece tested positive, and we literally had to beg the authorities to get the rest of the family tested. Uh, That's how bad it was. And that was something I noted very personally in the family.
Thank you, Samreen. We have a few more minutes, maybe five, and last two questions. Um, our second last question is from Asif Iqbal, who is a research scholar at Aligarh Muslim University. He wants to know the speaker's views about the Gupkar Declaration, or what they now call the People's Alliance, which was just formed, I think, a few days back. Junaid, maybe you could begin.
Yeah, so for those of you who don't know about Gupkar Declaration, Gupkar is a street in Srinagar, which is on one side you have a huge military establishment, on the other side of the street are pro-India political parties and their residences and their offices. So the Gupkar Declaration was basically based on last year, just before August 5 happened. Some of these pro-India parties, National Conference, PDP, and several others who had been alliance partners of BJP at one point or the other, they came together and basically passed a resolution saying that the special status, which means Article 370, should be retained. And but right after that, many of them were put under house detention and whatnot. So there have been many of them have been released. Some after 7 months, some 8 months. And Mahbooba Mufti, who's like the chief of the PDP, People's Democratic Party, one of those pro-India parties, and she came out recently. And so they passed a new resolution saying that the parties will work together to restore Kashmir's Article 370. Now in Kashmir, the struggle has not been restoration of Article 370 so much. The struggle, with which masses identify, is basically ending the occupation altogether. And so these parties are on one side trying to make themselves relevant, like, because historically they sided with the Indian state. They even participated in governments that alongside BJP. And I mean, they want to work within the framework of Indian constitution, which the Indian government used to deny all rights to Kashmiris, right? I mean, so, and the Kashmiris are quite rightly wary of some of these declarations. However, having said that, I mean, I also think that, and this is like to Kashmiris who are quite skeptical of these parties, as I am, that this is a moment where we also need to perhaps, rather than ally with each other, kind of see where some of this goes without kind of like banking on it completely. I mean, I'm a skeptic. Having understood the history of Kashmir, I'm quite skeptical of these gestures. I mean, they don't often translate into anything on the ground. These are empty negotiating points so that India can kind of like throw them a few crumbs, which means administrative power, and so that they can forget. Because the history of Article 370 from 1953 onwards has actually precisely been these series of compromises. I mean, these parties are also changing their goalposts. Like until last year, for instance, National Conference was saying that they want to return to the pre-1953 status of Kashmir. And now they're saying that they want to return to pre-August 5, 2019 status. So the larger question is, are they going to come out with an open declaration against settler colonial project? Are they going to align themselves with the mainstream Kashmiri sentiment, rather than being this, I mean, assuming that everybody in Kashmir simply wants return of Article 370? So those are the important questions that they have to ponder over, because over the last few years, they have lost a lot of credibility. They already had very little, but they lost a lot of credibility.
Samreen, you want to jump in about your views on the Gupkar Declaration and the so-called People's Alliance?
Just one point, like not even any views on that, because I don't think they even deserve that kind of an importance where they are currently, because of the way they have socialized. Am I audible?
Yeah, go ahead. It's
Uh,
Yeah,
Yeah, so they have supervised massacres, they have supervised mass blindings in Kashmir. So in that sense, I don't even think they have a moral political authority, to now come up and tell us that there's a declaration that we to report faith in, because I think so long as they frame all of their issues and grievances within the framework of the Indian Constitution, uh, they'll at best always be these client politicians serving the Indian regime, or used and thrown away at will by the Indian state. And for that reason, they'll always be this fringe uh, that is always seen distinct to Kashmir's demand for freedom, because uh, even in the Gupta Commission, really, even when they are now talking of these land laws as outrageous, we do see how they still, cling to the hope of Indian democracy in Kashmir, and Kashmir being an integral part of India. Uh, so, in that sense, I don't really, not even, skeptic in that sense, but pretty sure that so long as that continues to be the framing, that there won't be, much of how one would want to engage with their politics or the lack of it.
thank you, Samreen. Our last question is from someone called Kosher Listener, which is perhaps aptly titled Kosher for those of you who don't know, means Kashmiri. So the Kashmiri is listening. This is for Junaid, but I think feel free, both of you, Samreen as well, to talk to the question. Do you see any opportunities, chances, and hopes for meaningful solidarity from the Indian people with Kashmiris, or anything beyond that solidarity if I am not dreaming? But let me also add, if you could speak to the broader question of solidarity, not just with Indian people, but other struggles globally. Junaid, maybe you want to
Um,
begin?
yeah. So, look, India is also quite diverse in terms of the views of people. I mean, we have lived there in many ways. Like some of us have studied there. On one side, there, it is hugely disappointing and disheartening that what we have been seeing over the last 3 decades. I mean, first of all, for a major chunk of the history, there was this willful ignorance about Kashmir in India. Then we had this Bollywoodization of Kashmir, which kind of also erased Kashmiri agency, turning Kashmir into this landscape of romance. And then from 90s, Indian media and the Bollywood kind of turned Kashmir into this space of danger infested with terrorism. I mean, to be honest, the mainstream opinion in Kashmir, in India, has been that Kashmiris do not have agency. They are either these innocent people who are being manipulated by Pakistanis, and they don't know what they're asking for. Or their view has become, especially over the last 3 decades, that Kashmiris are killable. They are their lives do not matter. And this is extremely disappointing. But I mean, we have to recognize that a lot of this discourse comes from upper classes, the middle classes, and the upper caste communities. There are also a lot of other communities that are struggling for justice in India. Dalits, the Adivasis. There are progressive people who have. I mean, we know that there have been some meaningful alliances, and people who have expressed solidarity with Kashmir. Um, I am a little bit skeptical at this moment, that what has happened to India, because India is now facing a huge crisis in terms of how this majoritarian fascism has grown with the rise of Modi. But at the same time, I think that we have to look at the solution of Kashmir within this larger South Asian context. We are part of this larger region called Central and South Asia, and we need solidarity from people, good, well-meaning people who are not invested in imperial state projects. So I wouldn't just go ahead and dismiss anyone. I think that Kashmir needs to ally with progressive movements. And when I say progressive, I mean those movements that want to expand the rights of people rather than restrict them. And I mean, we have been alone in a way in this struggle so far. We have had some solidarity from people in Pakistan, but I think we need to broaden our horizon as well, to be open to solidarity instead of being skeptical of solidarity.
Samreen, you want to address the final question of solidarity?
Uh, Not really going into the diversity and different communities in India and how they would approach the Kashmir question, for example, but something that I've noted over the years of my stay in Delhi is how this liberal activist class, even as they would express solidarity, one it is a dilution of the Kashmiris own narratives. So instead of centralizing Kashmiri narratives, what this solidarity seeks to do is actually uh, uh, throw away the Kashmiri and speak on behalf of the Kashmiri. So that's one issue that I have had with a lot of people as they claim to express solidarity. Another is also in the way that they would frame the Kashmir problem as if it started with the BJP because that aligns with their own politics in a way. Uh, so, in that sense, yes, solidarities are really important, but also one would want those solidarities to be mindful of, centralizing the people whose narratives, on whose behalf they're claiming to speak. Uh, uh, and so letting their story be at the center, and rather than taking over and snatching the mic, perhaps just amplifying that voice, which here is of the Kashmiris as we're speaking.
Thank you, Samreen. We are out of time. I want to thank everyone for attending, especially the participants, and also a shout out to the KSM team here for putting this talk together. It has been a long time coming. We had programs planned earlier in spring, but then the COVID happened, and they have put in a lot of effort over the past few months to have this conversation here at Brown. And we hope that we'll have more and more conversations. Thank you, Samreen, especially for speaking to us all the way from Kashmir. We know it's late and there were so many problems with your internet connection. So thank you so much. And thank you, Junaid, for joining us from nearby Massachusetts. And thank you to everyone for attending again. Have a great rest of the week, and we hope to see you again soon.